Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual learning session, Navigating Digital Transformation, a Blueprint for Success. My name is Sarah. I am the VP of Marketing here at BrainSell, and I will be your host for this event. But before I turn it over to our presenters to introduce themselves, I'm going to run through a few quick housekeeping items. So we've carved out about 45 minutes for this presentation and encourage your interaction throughout. So if you have any questions at any point during the discussion, drop them into the question box. I'll monitor that and serve up your questions to our presenters as we go. And finally, this session is being recorded. You will receive an email, likely in your inbox tomorrow morning, containing a link to the recording, the slides, and all other resources that we referenced during the conversation today. So with that, time to get to the good stuff. Tony, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Great, yeah, and I'm Tony Berry. I'm a senior solution architect at BrainSell, and kind of my area of focus and passion is around data integration, analytics, and all the insights that can be gathered from that.
Great, thank you, Tony, for being here today. And Liz.
Hi everyone, I'm Liz Seville. I'm the Director of Consulting Programs here at BrainSell, and my area of focus and passion is around the people and process side of these digital transformations.
Wonderful, thank you, Liz. And I'm going to go ahead and let you navigate through these next few slides.
Sounds great. So for those of you who haven't worked with BrainSell before, BrainSell is a growth enablement company. And what that means simply is we help companies grow and scale. And BrainSell was founded about 30 years ago now and was a value-added reseller. So really focusing on the software space of reselling software, CRM, ERPs, add-ons, you name it. And ultimately since then has branched out into consulting as well. So works across not only technology, but across people, technology, data, and processes as well. All right, and for our agenda today, we're going to start with just an overview of what digital transformation is. Well, I guess we'll get into a quick poll first for the audience, and then we'll jump into what digital transformation is. We'll talk about the benefits and challenges that we see among our customer base with digital transformation, and then we'll talk about a blueprint for success. So really, how do we go about these digital transformations successfully and use a case study to be able to support that. But as Sarah mentioned, we would love for this to be interactive, and we'll have some Q&A at the end, so we'll try to leave plenty of space for that discussion. Great. So as mentioned, we're going to start things off with a quick poll. We'd just love to understand a pulse check of the audience we have with us today. Do you currently have a digital transformation initiative? The options here, yes, it's in process, you're planning on it, no, you don't have one right now, or what is a digital transformation initiative?
We have 50% have voted, so we'll give others a chance
quick
to weigh in.
Quick on the keyboard.
And then we'll reveal the results. Give people a few more seconds to respond. Okay. I'm going to share. Looks like we have 17% have a digital transformation initiative in process, 50% not right now, and 33% what is a digital transformation initiative? You've come to the right place.
Truly, truly. Awesome. Okay. Thank you all for voting.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and so what we thought we'd do first, and it sounds like this is the right thing from the poll we just saw, is just describe what we look at as what is a digital transformation. And you can really think about this as the digitizing of the business. So it's really taking this idea of people, process, data, and technology, and combining them to create a positive business impact, and doing that at scale. So this isn't just within a single functional area, it's really across the whole organization. And there are really 5 key benefits that come from digital transformation initiatives. One, which is probably obvious, is an increase in efficiency. A lot of times it's focused on enhanced customer experience. It's on how to get more out of the organization from a scalability standpoint. And one that's near and dear to me is getting more data-driven insights So the organization is now managing more from a data-driven aspect than just purely instincts. And then there are typically some cost savings that come from that. And so what you might ask yourself, is it worth doing this? Because it's not a trivial exercise, as we'll talk about. But companies that embrace it and are successful in their digital transformations are 26% more profitable than their competitors. So it truly is a competitive advantage to go through this type of exercise and become that digital transformed company that's data driven. That's not easy. And a lot of these initiatives do not end up successfully. And what's really interesting is those 70% of digital transformation projects that fail don't fail because of the technology aspect of it. So it's not the digitization of the business that causes the failures. It's really the soft challenges. So there are really 5 that we see. One is really unclear planning and objectives. This is one of those cases where you really do need to plan and set specific objectives for the initiative. You need to really think about change management, because as you digitize the business, almost everything goes through some sort of change component, and that needs to be thought of. And one of the big things we see is really now having information available and accessible and understood by the whole organization, and the management and governance around that data. A lot of times what we see too is there's a reluctance to move off maybe some legacy systems that are kind of locked in the organization. And so by freeing those up, getting tighter integration, that really frees up that data for that analysis. And then often, and we'll talk about this through the case study, you have to be careful that you don't jump to technology too quickly. You really do need to focus on the people and the process side first, and then the technology becomes an enabler. And so that is really the 5 key challenges. But the thing that we want to focus on and kind of talk about today is, what can you do as an organization who pursues this to avoid those failure points? And as we mentioned, it's not because of technology. It's really to focus on the people, the process, and the data side of the organization, and really doing that with a partner that's been through this and has done several of these historically, and understand what works and what doesn't work. And that's what we're going to actually talk about today, is how to lever that people, process, and technology component.
As Tony was mentioning, digital transformations are tricky. One of the things that we've seen with folks going through these digital transformation initiatives, that sometimes they try to do it without a plan. And ultimately, we use the analogy of, you wouldn't build a house without a blueprint. We also don't think that you should execute a digital transformation without a plan in place as well. So on the left, you'll see the Smith Mansion, which was built in the 1980s. I'm thinking you can guess which one was built without a blueprint, but the Smith Mansion was not built with a blueprint, versus the Frank Lloyd Wright Falling Water House on the right. And that was built almost a century ago, still standing and functioning within the ecosystem that it was surrounded by as well. So the Smith Mansion ultimately, unfortunately, though it's a younger house, if you will, than the Frank Lloyd Wright house, is uninhabitable and truly didn't have some of the bones that it needed to, including indoor plumbing and electric and the right pitch of the roof. So ultimately wasn't able to successfully scale as a house. And Frank Lloyd Wright's house, still standing and doing quite well. And truly, we like to use that analogy to just say, we think building a blueprint for success for digital transformation or any kind of technology initiative is just as crucial, and just the true foundation for success for any kind of company initiative as well, just like building a house. So as this implies, a blueprint is risk mitigation. So blueprints internally here at BrainSell, we have an offering that is a digital transformation blueprint. Ultimately, it's a solution blueprint that sets you up for success to be able to press pause on where you are as a company today before you go into some of these digital transformations, to understand your current state, understand your future state goals, understand those pain points and your current systems and technology and processes in place, and then be able to create that roadmap to success for data, people, process, and technology as well. So what we have seen on the left-hand side here are some of the common failures without that proper plan being in place, versus on the right-hand side, with a blueprint being in place, some of the successes that come from digital transformation initiatives. So some of the common failures we see could be over-engineering a solution that becomes super complex and cumbersome, really hard to maintain and keep up with because it's so complex. It might also be just a lack of training and user adoption. Maybe people aren't really bought into this change, as well as Tony had mentioned, change management might have been an omission. It could be that there's no cross-system views, or that the data is not set up for success. So you might have executed digital transformation without really thinking about that outcome in mind and being able to reverse engineer a way back into that. Well, on the contrary, on the other side, when you do have a blueprint or a plan in place, you'll be able to have some of these user adoption issues be completely mitigated and be able to have that roadmap to success there. You'll have a full customer lifecycle view, being able to have a unified process that you're working with throughout your company. You can also have views across those systems and have your whole tech stack and data ecosystem really working in synergies. And what does this blueprint process and methodology look like? For us, it's a series of subject matter expert interviews where we're really getting to know your team, getting to know the users of these systems, and ultimately then also doing some system reviews as well, understanding what your systems look like today, how they're configured or customized, or maybe systems that might not be there today, that there might be a gap as well, or there could be a redundancy also. So just really understanding that tech stack for you, going deep into the process mapping. This is where I have a huge passion, but it ultimately is the foundation for understanding where those process inefficiencies are, where there are efficiencies, and ultimately is the baseline that you can use for those user stories in the future as well. And then we do conclude with a findings review, which is a presentation of those findings and that roadmap to success. And usually that does include a proof of concept demonstration of what does that future state and recommended future state look like for everyone as well. And what does this look like in terms of time investment? It's usually about a 4 to 8 week time frame in order to go through the blueprinting process. So instead of jumping right into the digital transformation, it does have that first phase of a pause. When we're able to do these deeper analyses, we're able to have that strategic alignment and check in to make sure that we are aligning our recommendations with your strategic goals. And then this is where we also would have a kickoff. We'd be able to have those SME interviews. We'd be able to have those process mapping discussions and systems reviews, data and KPI reviews, and ultimately, as mentioned, have that culmination be that findings review presentation where we can present those findings back to you all. All right, so Tony and I will discuss some of the outcomes of blueprints. Ultimately, we'll caveat with blueprints for our client base can be pretty customized depending on where you are as a company and what your needs are. So some of the things that could come out of this are a vendor decision matrix, which you'll see that very colorful graph there with the red, green, yellow. Ultimately, what we might do is be able to have a understanding of all of your requirements and then be able to have a short list of some software that might be a good fit for you to consider adopting. We'd always include your current state technology as well to make sure that we're assessing everything that's already within your wheelhouse and then coming up with some of those recommendations. We also would be able to do some process mapping, which you can see below in the bottom right. And that's, again, a live workshop where we're able to go through with you and really understand who's responsible for what at all stages of a process or a customer lifecycle in many cases. And then I'll turn it over to Tony to talk about the data and technology side of those outcomes.
Yeah, so as Liz was kind of mentioning, that once we get a good understanding of the requirements, the technology is in place, and those key processes and initiatives that you want to put together, we'll also take a look at the technology stack. And again, the technology is an enabler. So often what we'll find, and this is one of the areas where typically we'll see some of that cost saving, is there may be some consolidation or simplification of the systems that are in place. It's kind of wild, but a mid-sized company can have over 100 different source systems. And so we often find there's a chance to kind of consolidate through these initiatives. And then finally, what we want to make sure that we're doing as a result of this is getting everybody on that same proverbial page. And in this case, because this is a digitization effort, We want to typically put together some key KPIs, key performance indicators, and put those into a common shared dashboard that can be used by, really across the organization to understand how things are performing against what those goals and key KPIs are. And so that's what you're seeing in the middle there is a dashboard that was built for a client so that they could see some of those key indicators and some of the key trends so that they could make some of those data-driven insights and the efficiencies that come as a result of these types of efforts. Now, one thing we thought that might help is to go through an example. And so this is one of our clients who went through both a blueprint and then also went through the implementation of the results of that blueprint for a true digital transformation effort. This is a cybersecurity global risk management firm. What was happening here is there were two companies that were being merged together. Both were global. Both used completely different sets of systems. CRM was different, ERP was different, marketing tools were different, websites were different, but they were bringing these two companies together and wanting to combine those product lines into a very rapidly growing space and a very rapid hire as they expanded the merged company out to a global footprint. So they had some pretty unique challenges is how do you merge two companies, different culture, different processes, different systems. How do you align that sales process and tech stack? That was the first process area, was their whole front office that they wanted to look at. And then how do you start to get, as you're bringing new people on and you're merging the company, how do you get that single view? And their focus was really on the KPIs associated both with the merger and actually the new sales team that they were putting in place because of the merged company. So as I mentioned, they went through a blueprint. Out of that blueprint, we came up with 4 areas, and we'll show the outcomes here in just a minute. But was a process redesign, CRM consolidation, a modern data platform, and then change management. So I'm going to let Liz kind of describe the process redesign because this is the first piece that then led to the CRM consolidation.
Sure. Thanks, Tony. Ultimately, as Tony had mentioned, as you all probably are aware, consolidating systems without a unified process could be super tricky. So we didn't want them to go about that, not only speaking the same language internally, but really just not having the same sales processes in place. So ultimately, what this would look like and what this has looked like for this client was being able to do some buyer journey mapping, really understand what that buying cycle looks like, and then be able to back into understanding a sales process and do some process mapping across both companies, with then recommending a consolidated unified sales process and approach across both of those companies.
Yeah, what was great about the process mapping the team put together is that became really the guidebook for the way we consolidated the CRM and implemented it. Decision was made to wind off of one CRM and move on to another, and then follow that with some ERP changes in the future. But as you can imagine, that's not something you just push a button and automatically make happen. So the focus became on that future state sales process that Liz was speaking about. That became the rallying point for the CRM consolidation. It was the first of many phases associated with that. Then underneath that too, because we knew that some of the systems needed to stay, some of them needed to be enhanced, and we needed to get really cross-functional reporting, we put in place something called a modern data platform. This allowed us to bring all the data into one place and then essentially load the data in the new format to support the unified sales framework. And we'll show some examples of this in a second. And I'd be remiss if we didn't let Liz talk about change management. As you can imagine, there was a great deal of change with the merging of the two companies. And this is the piece that candidly is often not thought of, but extremely important. So I'll let Liz describe that initiative of this transformation.
Thanks, Tony. Yes, change management is really overarching across the process, across the technology and across the data. We want to make sure that after investing this time and money and energy into this kind of initiative, that it's successful, and making sure to manage that change and ensure that there's user adoption across the way is crucial for that. So what that looks like is having a change management communication plan and really having a change practitioner and a change sponsor be able to execute and communicate that change internally. But it also means having an understanding and a pulse check on the teams and individuals within the organization and where they are on this change journey. So making sure that there's mitigation for any change angst felt across the company and the organization, because ultimately that could impact this user adoption and the success and the rollout of change. I think we've all been in organizations when there's been a change rolled out and then somebody or several folks are going back to the old way because it's just the easier way, because that change journey and helping to get over the hump is challenging, but having the right change management practices in place can make sure that it is a success. Right, so as we had mentioned, process mapping is a huge component of these kind of changes and ultimately of this change for the case study that Tony was talking about. So what that does look like is having a confirmation of swim lanes that we'd be working with, and we'd have those small workshops where we're really able to understand what folks are doing and drive that conversation and facilitate meaningful discussion about all those handoff points. From a process standpoint, the handoff points really do necessitate some risk ultimately, and that will then be able to make some of those recommendations in the future from technology, from automation, from a data standpoint of how do we streamline some of these processes to mitigate the risk in process, to streamline the data that's being collected, and to ultimately just make sure that this is as frictionless of an experience as possible so that there is increased user adoption and we're making lives for folks easier rather than more cumbersome.
Great. And another thing, and Liz just talked about the process re-engineering or analysis that can occur as you start to look for efficiencies. The other big area that we see that's common across all digital transformations is at its core, you can think of data as really the oxygen now that is powering the business. And so how do you take that oxygen and make it become the fuel that you really need to make business decisions? So we'll often put in some form of a modern data platform. People have probably heard of tools like Snowflake, like Databricks. Microsoft has something called Fabric that they've come out with, but it is this idea of not all the data that I need to make my business decisions on a day-to-day basis are coming from one system anymore. So think of this as a place that you bring all that data together, you consolidate it, you put governance on top of it, and that's what's coming on the left-hand side, and then over on the right are the actual output. So the things so you can make decisions as a business, you can drive BI and analytics. We've probably all heard all the great things that generative AI can do. Generative AI needs this data though, and it needs to be trained, thankfully, by a human still today. And so this is really what sets that platform for it. And then you're starting to see a lot of what are called data apps now, apps specifically around the digitization of the business. So we'll often put something like this in place. This is for the case study we talked about. This was a critical part of it. And the next slide will actually show you one of the initial dashboards that we built off this platform. So in this case, this is coming from, it may not look like it here, but this is coming from multiple systems, 2 different CRMs, 2 different ERPs, and actually had a marketing tool input. But as Liz mentioned, the initial process redesign was to focus on essentially a new sales model, new way of managing their pipeline and their products. So this was the first of several dashboards that we turned on that showed them not only what was in each of the CRMs, but what the new pipeline was starting to look like. And this became the onboarding tool, the management tool, the tracking tool across those opportunities and revenue. So it was a very simple dashboard that everybody was trained on, from executives all the way down to individual contributing salespeople. But this is where they could go and see that consolidated pipeline. And this was on top of that modern data platform rather than being fed out of each of the CRMs, because there was also an opportunity that was in one CRM in the first month was moving over to the new CRM a month later. So we had to carry that through from the system as they went from old to new.
Actually, Sarah, before you move forward, I'm just going to make a plug for Tony's team and the work that they did here. I think, Tony, you did a great job of explaining it, but ultimately to go back to that impact too, what this meant, as you can imagine, from a unified executive team, what they were doing prior to this being in place was ultimately wrangling data from tons of spreadsheets, trying to make sure that they equated process step 1 over here with process step 3 over here, and it was a mess and causing them so much manual work and labor, and ultimately became super challenging to report internally, to forecast, to be able to make data-driven decisions. But ultimately, they also had a parent company, it was really hard for their parent company to understand performance, and that ended up becoming a full-time job for several executives until this kind of unified dashboard was put in place. So truly does have such a huge impact to be able to align those processes, align the data, have the right data infrastructure in place in order to allow for these kind of unified dashboards to be available. And then from a change management perspective, ultimately on these kind of larger scale projects, trying to really understand who are the impacted groups, and then be able to really get a pulse check for the readiness for change. So at BrainSell, we are ProSci change management certified, and ultimately go through this kind of exercise and model of really getting a pulse check for the readiness for change across leadership, across the change management, and across project management as those core pillars, to see how far along folks are set up for success for a implementation or digitization of this kind of scale and effort.
Okay.
You talked, Tony.
Thank you both. So we are moving into the Q&A section of the presentation. We've had a few questions come in, and a reminder to others, if you have questions, go ahead and submit them now, and I will capture them. But as we're waiting for other questions to come in, Tony and Liz, we just covered a lot of information. What are your suggestions around the initial steps companies looking to get started on a digital transformation project? What could they do next?
To start where we just finished with change management, putting that in place of really understanding those project teams, who's going to be part of this project, who's going to be spearheading the change, and start putting those groups together internally to really start planning and carving out the time to make sure this is a priority. So just pure planning, getting the right groups in place, and obviously ensuring that you have the time and space devoted to make this kind of initiative and a priority.
Yeah, and probably one thing I'd add to that, Liz, too, and it kind of builds off of that as you start to identify kind of those change management leaders, is also think about what strategically you're trying to align to. So what is the organization trying to do from a strategic standpoint? The case study we showed was to merge two salespeople and to go after new markets. Often these initiatives do start with some sort of customer-facing initiative, but think of it from an outside-in approach. So how do people buy from us, and who, if that's your initiative, and who do they touch as they go through that buying journey? That's usually, you'll want to think about, you know, some functions that you may not normally think of that are involved with that go beyond sales. So marketing, service, sometimes some of the back office or product people may be involved in that do have an influence on that buying experience. So make sure that it's really cross-functional in terms of those functional areas that you identify, and then do the same thing from a system standpoint. What systems do they touch? This is usually the really interesting exercises. Liz will say, as you walk through processes, you'll start to see, oh my gosh, we didn't realize we had 6 systems that had customer information. We had one client working on it where that has to get keyed in 4 times through their buyer's life cycle. Well, imagine as a buyer that experience is you're getting asked again, what's your phone number? What's your email? What's your address? And that gets keyed in over and over and over again. It degrades the customer experience. And that's what these initiatives are meant to do, is to really take that friction out. And that's where the process, along with the technology, really start to help identify the areas that should be covered by the blueprint.
Good points. And I think another item would just be also to start putting your feelers out there for a partner to help you on this journey as well. We've mentioned the risk of the digital transformations, but ultimately the gain is definitely outweighs the risk if you have the right folks in place to help you with these kind of journeys. And they're multifaceted, so no shame in making sure that you find a right partner that works with you to be able to help support you along the journey.
Great, thank you both. The next question we have is, if we're already in the middle of a digital transformation initiative, is it worth doing a blueprint?
I think that both Tony and I would agree, yes. Ideally, it would be wonderful if we could all have the foresight to be able to press pause before we go into that digital transformation, but it's better to take a pause to be able to really strategically plan and then resume. And usually you're able to resume at a quicker velocity and more effectively as well. Then we've worked with customers who have found us after 2 or 3 years on a journey, and we wouldn't wish that upon anyone. We'd love you to partner with somebody earlier on and have this kind of blueprint in advance so that you can make sure that your plan is effective and set up for success.
Yeah. That's right. That's going to be my answer. If you didn't do a blueprint before you started your digital transformation, probably time to stop and do a blueprint. It really does become listed a perfect. It's that plan that you're going to build a digital transformation off of. Again, these things are not easy, and so you do need to have that guidebook that you keep going back to that tells you if you're directionally, in the right place. Do you have the right KPIs? Do you understand how you're going to define success? That's often one of the things that we suggest you kind of visualize is, okay, I'm 6 months out from my transformation project and I'm looking back and I'm trying to gauge whether it was successful or not. You don't want to say, I think it was, or it felt like it was. It should be no. We saw an improvement in our buyer's life cycle where it shortened by 30%. Our NPS score went up by X%. You want those types of metrics, and that's what the blueprint will identify for you is what are those key levers that these types of initiatives should be pulling that gets you in that 26% more profitable than your competitor, not in the 70% that didn't have a successful implementation. So we want you to have that 26% advantage over your competitors.
Yeah, great point. Another question that just came in, what is the average size of the business your company caters to?
Good question.
Very good question, yes. So we tend to work mostly with mid-sized companies, but we are mid to mid-enterprise companies in general. Ultimately, we have run the gamut across industries and company sizes. It really depends on where you are in your journey and the investment that you're willing to make. But ultimately, I think that was a non-answer, but usually mid to mid-enterprise. But we have worked with folks that are also in early stages and trying to put a blueprint in place to set their companies up for success when they're just starting out too. And that also can be a niche that is pretty effective as well. Anything to add there, Tony?
Yeah, I was gonna say it runs the gamut. I think, we've worked with everything from, 10-person startups all the way up to, Fortune 500 type customers and within divisions. So I think I'd almost approach it as, is there a business opportunity or a strategy that if you knew that you became more data driven and digitized as a business, that you'd have a better experience for your customers and that you could potentially be more efficient and obviously be more profitable. And if you have that situation and you've got multiple systems and like Liz described, you're doing a whole bunch of wrangling to make decisions. And by the time you get all the data wrangled, it's changed already, then you're primed for a digital transformation. These don't have to be huge efforts. Like Liz said, they can be vetted usually within 4 to 8 weeks. And so it's a pretty quick vetting process too to see if you will actually get impact from a transformation. Most organizations do, but that's what the blueprint will identify for you.
Great, thank you. And final question, unless there's any that folks want to drop in now, is the question I'm sure on a lot of people's minds, but how much does a blueprint cost?
Great question.
I say I'm just an engineer, so I get to answer this one.
So similar that it's multifaceted and there's a lot of factors that go into place. It could be for smaller initiatives, a blueprint could be about $15,000 all the way to $70,000+, depending on the number of systems that we're going to be evaluating, the number of people that are part of the SME interview group, the complexity of your systems and your internal processes, the number of processes that would be mapped. So there are several factors that go into determining price, but the great thing is like we can work with customers where they are. It's pretty customizable depending on the deliverables that you want and what output you're trying to get, that we usually can work with customers within their budget depending on what you're trying to get out of the initiative and how large the initiative would be.
Yeah, I think actually Liz brings up a really good point. We've done, I think, over 100 of these now, so we've got a really good idea of what the cost will be, and we've got a calculator that's based on number of functional areas, number of systems, kind of what those key outcomes are. And we can definitely fit it to a budget and make sure that there's a good positive outcome from it. But we can highly recommend a blueprint. It's not BrainSell, find another partner that's done this, but it is definitely something that we find makes these initiatives much more successful.
Fantastic, thank you both. So that concludes our Q&A section, but before we wrap up, I do want to direct attendees to a couple of resources we're offering to help you navigate your digital transformation effort. The first is our digital transformation playbook. If you have your phone near you, you can scan the QR code on the screen now to access the playbook. We'll also include a link to it in the follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow morning. This resource really dives deeper into the areas of digital transformation that we covered today. So your people, your processes, your data, your customers, and your technology. And then additionally, we're also offering a complimentary 20-minute digital transformation readiness discussion. And this is really a great opportunity for those of you who haven't embarked on an effort yet, or you're early in the process, as well as those Tony and Liz mentioned that are actively navigating through an initiative. So if you're interested in taking advantage of this, you can email us at growth@brainsell.com to schedule, and we'll also include a link to book a time in the follow-up email as well. And with that, I want to thank you, Liz and Tony, for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thanks to everyone for joining and participating in the conversation and your great questions. And everyone, have a great rest of your week.
Great. Thank you all. Appreciate it.